Hello, everyone, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us today on the final day of RightsCon to discuss the rise of workplace surveillance hardware and software and how we can collectively build a movement to challenge it. My name is Ayden Férdeline, and I will be the moderator of today's session. On our panel today, we have Eduardo Carrillo, the co-director of the Paraguayan nonprofit TEDIC, Wilneida Negrón, the director of policy and research at coworker.org, Andrew Pakes, Research Director at Prospect Union, and Stephanie Perrin, who is on the advisory board of the Electronic Privacy Information Center. As you might be aware, workplace surveillance technologies are now everywhere today. They range from the commonplace, like video surveillance cameras, to robots that make pizza and take away jobs in the process, through to more stealth technologies that are getting much less awareness. Everything from devices that track the physical movement of workers through geolocation software, ID badges with microphones embedded inside, cameras that are recording eyes to monitor worker attentiveness, even desk chairs that measure heart rate to capture whether workers are alert or not. Just a note for everyone today, we also invite your participation as well. You can use the Q&A function to submit your questions, and we will get back to those questions before this session closes. To frame this discussion this morning and to provide you with a state of the union as to what technologies are out there surveilling workers, I'm first going to turn over to Will to introduce a recent investigation by coworker.org into what she calls little tech. This research examined 528 workplace technologies. Will, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. But as Ayden mentioned, really the past 3 years, both the combination of COVID, the economic instability that created, and as well as sort of the increased investments that happened due to the economic instability, which led to a lot of investors putting money into riskier asset classes like venture capital, led to sort of a tech boom that was sort of fed both the need for more digital solutions and also fed sort of the instability in the marketplace. So we've had really the past 2 years have documented a proliferation of new tech products that have entered the workplace. And as Ayden mentioned, a lot of this is not new. What we were interested in was in sort of quantifying and understanding the market and then trying to think about how do we frame it in a way that would be sort of distinct from the big tech conversations that tend to dominate how we think about technology policy and the role of regulations. And so we went ahead with the Little Tech framework, which is really, as you can see here, it's sort of trying to provide a framework for people to think about. Other than the 5 big tech companies, there is still an unregulated marketplace of mid-sized companies, established vendors that always tend to fly under the radar for the most part, such as Thomas Reuters and Equifax, apps and startups that are this whole other tech innovation ecosystem. And this ecosystem is increasingly producing technology that is not only touching on every facet of our lives, like whether it's education, but for us in the workplace, it's really touching on every aspect of the labor process, from AI automated hiring and recruitment software, to productivity monitoring, to workplace benefits, where you have to use facial recognition to access your unemployment benefits, to reskilling and retraining, and to the expansion to that as well, even though it's sort of implicit, is also the expansion of the gig economy. So our database and sort of our analysis was really thinking of what is a tech industry doing as it relates to the labor process that workers have to navigate, and the expansion, and through that relationship, the expansion of the gig economy. And I'm gonna just go over some of the findings, and we'll have future conversations around it. But we really understood very early on that the proliferation of the technology really took the conversation beyond privacy and surveillance, where it's sort of a lot of the conversations, at least in the US context, tend to fall into that. And in particular, we noticed a pattern of economic harms where a lot of the technology, especially the workplace productivity tools, they increase the information asymmetry, which equates to power in the workplace for workers between employers and employees, meaning that your worker knows a lot more about you and can make decisions about your job, how you do your job, whether you should be fired, because they are able to collect much more information about you, and you have less information about what exactly is being collected and understood about you. So there's the information asymmetry is increasingly on the favor of employers. And for us, that's particularly concerning in low-wage sectors where historically there's already an imbalance in power and information asymmetry. And so for marginalized workers, that is been a big issue. For white-collar workers, as I'm sure Andrew will talk about, it's been a real shock for them, because for them, they have felt like they have had power in the workplace. They've had somewhat, they have bigger credentials, more education, and now they're finding themselves sort of having managerial control at a higher level, experiencing at a higher level due to technology, and that's more monitoring, more surveillance, et cetera. But the way that workers frame that is really around not surveillance and privacy necessarily. It's about a safety and a workplace safety issue, and a workplace health and wellness issue. And so that is a conversation that would engage other regulatory agencies in the US. And then as far as the information asymmetry, there's also the ability for employers to extract more labor, more efficiency, more productivity from workers without necessarily the added compensation. And so a lot of workers that we've talked to have talked about, like, we've always had quotas to meet, but now it's like it is even more intensified. Like you are on a clock to sort of produce more, and we're still getting, minimum wage or less. And so the ability to extract more for workers, as workers still have, again, in the US context, minimum wage is years behind being at the level it needs to be. It is problematic. The third piece is also that it's, and this goes into the gig economy, but the economic exploitation that can happen through the lack of transparency on wages. And we know that we did some work with shift workers who actually worked with a technologist who tried to understand the change in the algorithm that was affecting their wages that was not clear to them, and they were missing wages, and they were not able, the company, this was shipped in the US as a delivery company, was not being clear about that wage change that was caused by the algorithm. So the workers had to get together with a technologist and start collecting their receipts and their information and start analyzing it and build the evidence themselves for how that algorithm actually was leading to them getting reduced wages. And eventually the company made a choice and made a change, but the amount of additional labor that workers have to do to show harms is incredibly, that was one particular worker technologist experiment. And there's the issue of wages is something that sort of cuts across a lot of gig economy companies. And the other piece is that the commodification of workers' data is accelerating. Workers are increasingly getting information about their sentiment being collected, their mental health status or health information. And we're finding that a lot of the companies that are collecting that information, they can use that data in case of a sale or a merger. And so that means that the value of some of these newer companies that are collecting some of this data, the value if they are to make an exit or reach an IPO and enter the public markets, in case of a sale or a merger, some of the data they collect in workers is part of the value that they bring to whoever is purchasing or merging with them in a case of a merger and acquisition. And so it's not, again, it's that sort of what has happened to us in the consumer space, where like our personal family pictures have made Facebook a multi-billion-dollar company. The same is happening for workers, and should workers be entitled to, as their data is contributing to the value of certain companies, should they be entitled to some of that? And the second point that is featured here, and Ayden, feel free to tell me when we should transition as well. But little tech, commodifies workers in an unequal economy, and that's sort of the point that I mentioned before. We have found products that are collecting consumer data, such as criminal justice history. There's a particular company called Appri's Retail that merged with Equifax, and they are collecting criminal justice information on citizens of the US. They created this particular database, and now Equifax acquired them and is going to integrate into their workforce management tool. And so there is a intersection of consumer and worker data merging that is happening in terms of the technologies that are being developed to help managers assess everything from who's a good cultural fit in my company, like do a hiring pre-assessments, to again monitoring, determining the risk of certain workers in the workplace. And so the merging of bringing the consumer data into the workplace space is sort of like a new terrain in the US, again, in the absence of any overarching consumer framework, as it is privacy framework. And I think it's important, like, for this conversation as well, to really talk about the ways that workers are beginning to push back. And as I mentioned before, there is a lot of work in the gig economy space, a lot of organizing, and both at the very local or at the national level, where workers are starting to just again do their own build their own, in partnership with researchers or technologists, like build their own body of evidence of the harms of the practices of some of these companies and gig economy companies. And for the most part, regulators at the state and the local are being responsive, but it would be great to be, as the companies are proliferating and the products are, to be much more proactive and future facing. So the burden is not on workers who are marginalized to begin with to make the case for protections. And really quickly, there's a lot of text there, but in unionized sectors, there is a lot of models of, and I have some other work that Prospect has done, of how workers are beginning to collectively bargain at the firm level, at the employer level. These are at sectors that are unionized. So working with labor unions at the company level or industry level to be able to collectively bargain and set a basic set of rights for workers. It's something that has a lot of momentum, but again, it takes a lot of organizing, a lot of education and outreach. And then there's, the non-unionized sectors. You have, these broader movements, the gig workers movement, the tech workers movement, that sometimes aligns with the needs of workers that are in lower wage sectors that are experiencing, workplace surveillance. So there's a lot of organizing, as we've been following in, anybody can sort of see in the news at the moment. Sometimes the organizing is around workplace conditions. Sometimes it's about the role of technology, like the tech workers movement, like having a say in how technology is developed in a way that's not harmful to communities and to workers. And so there's a lot of momentum, but what is the question is, like, what is the policy response. So far, the policy and the regulatory is fairly quiet. And the final point for now, I'll leave the last point for our conversation is that, you know, the past 2 years, there has been because of the economic instability and investors having to put their money in riskier asset classes, there has been a historic investment in venture capital, and that has led to just a rapid period of innovation. At the moment, it's sort of with potential more economic instability and inflation affecting many countries, it's starting to slow down. But really, in the past 2 years, the amount of companies that have come out into the market really are a lot of them are gonna be the next Facebooks and the next Googles of the world, and they have much more. They're not social media companies, internet marketing. They're much more sophisticated. Companies are using machine learning in very intrusive ways, and so essentially, what I'm saying is like we're in a period of we're still sort of responding to the tech innovation of the past 10 to 15 years, and we're already in sort of the next big wave, and still workers don't have even a basic level of protections in the workplace. And as they navigate an economy that is expanding through the gig economy and becoming more unstable. And so we feel a certain urgency of like, yes, let's organize, let's collectively bargain, let's, you know, do investigations, let's do those things, but there's still a sense of urgency of like, will the regulatory and the legal frameworks ever be able to be future focused enough to catch up to really the next big wave of companies and gig economy companies that are already in the market, but will be growing in the next 5 or 10 years.
Thank you so much, Wilneida. That was an excellent overview of the state of workplace surveillance tech at present. I do have one follow-up question before I turn over to all of the speakers, and that is around the technologies that we are seeing in workplaces, such as the technologies you mentioned around sentiment analysis. And that's just sort of a basic one. Is it accurate? Does it work? Does it actually reliably measure what it claims to do? Or are these technologies sort of vaporware that are potentially harmful because they are not necessarily accurate?
Yeah, I think a lot of those sentiment analysis and mood analysis, they are not, you know, there's a basic lack of transparency to understand the data points that are going into the algorithm that's assessing. From the ones that have shown some transparency of what they're collecting, it's that the science is not there to prove that if you look at, you know, some of the tools try to get workers to do self-reporting, which is like that may be more scientifically, you know, viable if you ask, you know, have a fun tool that your HR sends you, just like, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, like how stressed are you today? Then there's some like very low tech ones, and then like they quantify like how a worker might be feeling. But some of them, you know, they measure everything from, you know, your attendance in, you know, if you've missed any days, any particular text that you may share on workplace, not your personal social media, although some of them may, but they may monitor sort of the tone of emails and phrases that you use. And so a lot of those things, when you start to get into that, I'm not sure that the science has been established for half of the data points that they seek to. But yeah, getting more transparency and then challenging the science, I think, is something that academia could do.
Thanks. Eduardo, is this technology being adopted globally? In Paraguay, for example, where you are you seeing these technologies rolled out too? Are they primarily affecting gig economy workers? Are white-collar workers also affected? What do you see?
Thank you, Ayden. First of all, I would also like to jump on the last question you did to Wilneida as well. And I'm thinking that aside from the accuracy debate, I would say that the actual necessity and proportionality from a human rights perspective, at least, is an interesting question that we should be addressing as researchers, as civil society advocates, because it's pretty, let's say, similar to the facial recognition accuracy debate. Like, should we be just asking for accuracy, or should we just be asking for why is this being implemented in the first place? So I think that's a question also that can give us much more space for acting and space for challenging the implementation of these sort of technologies. Now, going back to the question in Paraguay, in Latin America in general, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Just to put a bit of context, we are TEDIC. I am representing this organization. We're a digital rights organization operating in Paraguay on issues of freedom of expression, privacy, data protection, and so on. And we are at the same time members of the International Fair Work Project. So Fair Work is a UK project that has expanded globally now and is committed to highlighting best of work practices in the platform economy. So we're currently right now doing the first research in the country to rate gig economy platforms in Paraguay. Going a bit into the topic of the discussion, I think talking about addressing a LATAM overall situation is a bit complicated, I guess. When you think of worker surveillance or more broadly, the impact of digital technologies in the enjoyment of workers' rights. And I would say that there are two levels of actors with different levels of impact on workers' enjoyment of labor, privacy, freedom of expression rights. I mean, of course, the list can go very much longer, but I would like to concentrate on those maybe. I would say that on the one hand, and more related to national actors, so this would be the first level, there have been traditional ways in which workers are surveilled in the workplace that are not per se technology dependent, but cause a number of problems related to privacy and data protection. So I would say that in the context of Paraguay, for instance, we conducted research on how companies, in order to register workers to the Social Security, they ask for more health data than what they are required by law. So we're talking, for instance, about HIV tests. Year by year, we hear in Paraguay about reports from people who were fired or discriminated against in their jobs because of their HIV status. And what I want to say with this, I guess, is that workers' rights, unfortunately, workers' rights, rights to privacy and data protection have been historically violated. And this, of course, acquires a new dimension in the digital economy and the sort of post-pandemic world we're living in, if we may say. And the second level of actors that I would like to concentrate on are international actors operating in the LATAM region. And particularly, I want to focus on gig economy platforms such as Uber, Bolt, and the sort of traditional transportations, which are the ones that are right now more predominant in the region. We're also more and more seeing cloud work companies that are doing a lot of work in the region. But on this occasion, I just want to focus on the gig economy platforms. So in terms of the work that we're doing in the Fair Work project in Latin America, it is very evident at this point that gig economy platforms fail to meet workers' rights. So right now we have very conclusive research from Ecuador, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, for instance, who have scored, the researchers have scored very lowly to the gig economy platforms based on criteria such as fair pay, fair contracts, fair conditions, management, and representation. So I guess going back a bit on some of Wilneida's point, the issue of representation, for instance, is quite difficult because gig economy workers face a hard time when trying to unionize, for instance. So they do it at risk of being banned by the platform, at risk of, being blocked and suffer economical losses in an already very precarious economical debacle here in the region because of the pandemic. And I guess that the other thing that would be interesting to point is that because of the transnational nature of these companies, it is difficult for workers and researchers to establish a direct contact and dialogue with such platforms and ask for any sort of accountability. And in my opinion, I guess that this transnationality also poses an important data sovereignty aspect that should be more addressed. We're currently in a highly digital extractive scenario here in Latin America, both gig economy and also cloud work, whereby workers are providing vast amount of data, particularly biometric, for instance, for identification, but also data that is used for train AI projects from these very same platforms that are aiming in a maybe not so far future to create technology that will make the platform less dependent on workers' labor. So I guess the current scenario is quite complicated, and we are experiencing a highly precarious work condition for workers across areas, both digital and not, at least in Latin America, that needs to be further addressed and discussed to ensure a healthy, or to fight for a healthy work environment and for the full enjoyment of workers' rights.
Thanks, Eduardo. And Andrew, I might bring you into the conversation now. Perhaps you could speak about, for white-collar workers, how does the proliferation of these workplace technologies harm them? What is on the horizon? And do existing health and safety laws or other laws, in your opinion, provide any mechanisms that workers have been able to use to push back against these technologies?
Cool, thank you for bringing me in. Look, firstly, it's always a pleasure to be on these panels and to share it with Wilneida and co-worker. When you look at the challenges we're facing, I think this is the moment where we need to be sharing in forums like this, in different nationalities, locations and places, to understand how this technology works. We were already picking up in our professions, which are skilled engineering, science type jobs, and some professional jobs, kind of the essence of digital technology changing workspaces prior to the pandemic. But what we have seen during the last 2 years is this rocketing, this explosion of technology. And it's a really interesting balance, isn't it? It's a balance between technology, which kept many of us safe, well connected and working, in touch with relatives, in touch with work during a pandemic, also has the flip side of it. It has radically changed the nature and power of this technology to monitor and surveil us. And I think, when we have conversations with the public, it's trying to explain or take on that issue that just because something is useful on first viewing, it might have something behind the curtain. I always describe it, if people are familiar with The Wizard of Oz, when they see the wizard at the end with the big face on the screen, and actually it's behind the curtain, it is where this is happening. And our survey work continually shows, the last big public polling we did on this showed that 1/3 of British workers are now subject to some form of digital monitoring, which is up from just under 1 in 4 before the pandemic, so that goes up again. It showed that 13% of British home workers are now monitored by cameras on their laptops and devices whilst working from home. And I think that radically changes the nature of what is privacy. I think we could have a debate around being surveilled or watched in in an office, in a facility, in a factory. The ability of this technology, often without anyone knowing, can take pictures and check on you when you're sat in your kitchen or your spare room, when your family members are around you. It raises all sorts of other issues. What was really good, though, from our public surveying is that even though some of this technology is novel and it makes me cry thinking about how it functions and works, 80% of the British public support a ban on camera monitoring in people's private spaces in their homes. 2/3 support the idea that AI should be accountable, that companies can no longer say it's the data, it's the software. Just like health and safety, employers need to be held responsible for the harms and risks they cause. And that's what we're looking at in terms of putting together. I suppose that takes us in our approach to 3 reflections, which I think fit this discussion really well. Firstly, this is a global market for big and little tech, and we need a global movement to fight it. And that's why it's brilliant being on this panel and sharing other panels on it. The software that's coming into the UK market is largely software designed in the US or China or other parts of the world. And it might have a label on it that says it's compliant with our laws or compliant with GDPR, but how do we know? Secondly, this software isn't, at the point of entry. I always cite the good example is 365, and we use 365 as a union. At the day 365 was entered into, we got it as a good piece of software for email and other things. 3 months down the line, it introduced a productivity score. So this is not, this is not simple technology which you buy for one purpose. It's not like in the old days where you brought a fax machine to send a fax. You're buying technology which is augmenting over the times. Even our laws we have around GDPR, where companies have to do an impact assessment at the point of introducing software. What we know is this software is now taking up other forms of surveillance or productivity scoring or people analytics, which is deeply worrying for us. And that's a challenge for us because we need to stay on the back of it, which is why we need these global networks to understand how it functions and how we can fight back when it gets close to those lines that we're looking at. And the reality is, most companies in most parts of the world are not going to be big enough to build their own AI or to build their own software for specific purposes. So it is going to come back to big tech, and little tech will be big tech because there will be big capital investment and big companies and corporations sat behind it. And the brilliant work the co-worker done, I think, discovered over 500 products that do surveillance on the global markets, from the absurd things like Staff Cop and Sneak through to the commonplace such as 365 and some of those other main platforms, Facebook for Work and others we use. So it's a huge variation between snake oil on one end and mainstream products on the other, and we need this global movement like this thing. Second point is that we need collective rights over this, when too much of the discussion about data is based on individual privacy. And we certainly have that in the European space with GDPR, that it looks at individual rights for privacy. What we know is in the work relationship, it doesn't just affect me, it affects my co-workers. If I am discriminated against by an algorithm, it will affect other people with my characteristics. So yes, we should fight for individual rights so that people are not discriminated because of their sex or their gender or their race. But it's also a collective impact of discrimination. And I think we've got to fight on that to stop this being AI ethics or just technology-based privacy. And we know that from other walks of life. We know that when we've tackled equal pay, when we've tackled discrimination against disabled workers in the workspace, equality laws are based on collective harms and impacts, which are much more powerful than individual rights. And allowing tech companies to keep this in the technology box keeps us on the back foot. And we need to drag that into the open. If this is about work, then it should be subject to employment and legal equality rights in the way that we do everywhere else. And that's my third point, which is data is power. This data is being used to make decisions about us. It can choose whether it hires us or not. It can decide whether we're paid a bonus, whether we are reprimanded for not working hard enough. It can sack us automatically at the end of the day. And we see legions of examples of that around the world. The savage way that this is being used to stop bad bosses even having to face their workers when they take terrible decisions. They can automate victimization through the software that now has and make it more remote. So we become numbers on pages rather than human beings with hopes and fears. And that dehumanization of the work relationship fundamentally challenges our civic and human rights as well as our worker rights. So we know about, as unions, we know about power at work. We have consistently organized. We were born from industrial organization when people were literally killed in workspaces on a daily basis and harmed. And in many parts of the world, they still are. Data has the ability to dash people's lives, to change their opportunities, to make decisions about them and cause real life harm done through an algorithm or database. So we need to start organizing around the basis that data is the new power. And that's why I really like the health and safety operation of it, because it drags employers into discussing what happens at work. And we know that in the health and safety space, occupational safety and health. Yeah, if someone has an accident at work, if someone is electrocuted, if someone trips over their wires at the machine, if someone gets a workplace injury because of the condition of work, we know where the liability lies and we organize around that and we fight for that and we take people through to the courts if we need to and we win justice for those people affected and ensure it happens to no one else. We need the same patrolling of the borders of justice when it comes to how data is used about us and how those decisions are made about us. And just because we can't see it, because it happens in software, doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And that's one of the challenges around it. So definitely this is coming for us. It's coming for all workers. We've found examples in the last 2 years of software which originated in the warehouses, telling you how many things you have to pick, task allocation software, coming into engineering professions, coming into GPS tracking of workers wherever they're based. So what started in logistics and started with some of those workers who are most disparate is coming for the rest of us. And we have a choice to make, a choice to take a stand and redefine our rights, or a choice to let it go by. And I think all of us on here on the side of taking a stand, because just like equal pay, just like term hire and free fire, just like poverty pay, this is our cause. And it takes good people like us to try and raise to that standard.
Thanks, Andrew. You raised so many fascinating points there. And on the point of Microsoft's 365, you might have seen earlier this week that Microsoft has announced it has a new feature, a new corporate compliance tool to detect workplace collusion and corporate sabotage. And what I found particularly interesting about this was, what are the data sets that Microsoft is using to train this AI? And it is companies voluntarily sharing data with Microsoft to help these arbitrary decisions be made. And again, it feeds into that dehumanization of the work relationship that you mentioned. I'll bring Stephanie in now. Stephanie, your background is in privacy and data protection. So I want to start with a pretty basic question that I used to think I knew the answer to, but increasingly think I don't, which is, do workers actually have a right to privacy if they're being surveilled in the workplace?
Thanks very much, Ayden. And before I start, I'll do my usual caveat that I am not a lawyer. I'm a policy person who's worked on the development and harmonization of data protection law for quite some time. And the answer to your question briefly is no. It is not that workers' rights are not somewhere in data protection law, but rarely is it explicit in data protection law, a category of rights that a worker might have. Data protection commissioners can look at illicit gathering of data, gathering data without consent, over-gathering of such things as health data. But monitoring is more tricky. And usually and I should add that while many of these rights are guaranteed by your charter rights, by your constitutional rights, by your fundamental code of human rights, it's not necessarily the data commissioner's jobs, even while they're sympathetic to that. This is the Zoom law that as soon as it's your turn to speak, the phone rings and the neighbor has his lawnmower ready to crank up. Apologies for the background noise. So while they can look at that, they do not have the resources to do a human rights analysis of what's going on after a particular complaint. So this makes the whole matter very complex. And I don't think that I agree totally with Andrew that we need some kind of an uprising. This situation is getting dire indeed. And there needs to be some kind of a manifesto, a lot of work on a basic code of human rights in the workplace. And by the best of my knowledge, that has not been done. And it's something that demands our attention urgently, because data commissioners can only carve out their little piece of it as permitted by the interpretation of their data protection law. And it's extremely costly to take these cases to court to have a human rights application to stop a practice. I mean, imagine going after every little bit of software that's being let loose on gig workers these days. That would be expensive indeed, and with uncertain outcomes, and it wouldn't necessarily be internationally applicable. So that's an issue. Historically, we have accepted surveillance in the workplace basically on grounds of, and I'll start with the benign, health and safety, productivity, because an employer does have a right to measure the productivity in his workplace. The question is, how intrusive does that get into the minds and bodies of your workers? For instance, women have long had to put up with surveillance of their child bearing capacities and intentions, because most employers don't want women going off on maternity leave. This can be abusive in some cases. There's a health and safety argument to protecting women from health and safety situations if they might be pregnant. But this, of course, gives sort of an open door to all kinds of intrusion for that kind of monitoring. And now that we have apps mapping this, it's a real concern. So health and safety, productivity. Now I think Wilneida has raised a really important point about the value add. Employers, small and large, are using these apps to do data analytics on their workplace itself with a view to assessing how much of an asset that is in the case of a sale, in acquisition, shares, shareholder value. And so if you can, whether it's vaporware or not, if you can provide an assessment of your workforce, we have hired the smartest and we can prove it. We have hired the most loyal and we can prove it. If you buy our company, they're not all going to walk because we've done this kind of analysis on it. So that becomes a very important shareholder value aspect. And I don't think, in terms of at least the data protection community, we've looked at that. I don't think it's defensible under data protection law, but I don't know of any cases on it. So these are these overarching justifications for surveillance. And I don't think I mentioned security. Security is huge now in terms of a justification for monitoring your workers and getting intrusively into your brains. And one of the things that has troubled me for many, many years is our inroads into the minds of individuals. And we now have software that can be predictive of dissent. And the day we marginalized all the dissenters in society, we will not have a democracy anymore. And that includes anybody who's concerned about workers' rights. Those are the dissenters in chief. Going back to the earliest stage of data protection law, when it was brought in, it was a struggle between those who represented workers and the data gathering techniques of employers. So just keep that in mind as a sort of gold standard there. They will always want to know who the dissenters are and who the union organizers are. So I don't know whether I've helped to answer that question, Ayden, but those are my preliminary thoughts. I do think that pulling together some kind of a manifesto of rights, looking at what rights you have under human rights codes, laws, constitutions, what rights you might have under data protection law, and that's very regionally different, what rights you might have under labor law, something I'm not an expert in, but I know that many of these rights are in labor law, not in some of the other things I've mentioned. And what we expect as an information society and a democratic society going forward in terms of coming up with new concepts. My current focus of research is on how some of the concepts we've looked at in terms of data protection and human rights have come to a dead end and have not served us. And I do think that labor law is one of those areas where really we've got to be talking about ethics, morality, and human rights and how we want to function as a society. It requires some new thinking and some new precepts.
Thanks, Stephanie. And if I can follow up with one question that I'm sure is difficult, if not impossible to answer, which is, let's say that we do stumble across a new technology that is so egregious that we are certain that through some instrument, it is unlawful. And through some instrument, there is the ability to take action in some jurisdiction. What should be the first steps that we're taking? What can we do, be that as workers, as trade unions, to compile everything in a way to make someone with a remit, be that a data protection authority or another actor, to take action? What is it that those that do have these remits to take action, what do they want to see in the complaint? How can we sort of package everything up neatly in a way to make someone care?
I think that will depend on the powers of the particular authority that you're going to. So for instance, and I'm going to forget the name of the technology, you'll probably remember, I hope, but the European Data Protection Supervisor just wrote a very interesting short document about how one of these software products, we just have to ban its use because it gets into the brains of people. And that was further to an investigation where they looked at the technology in question. I'll look it up after I'm finished speaking and put the name in the chat. So that's an example where if you have a valid complaint that you can take to a data protection supervisor, make sure you make it clear in that complaint that what your fears are of the particular technology or practice. And with luck, they'll focus on that and issue a statement. I know in Canada, we have a very divided set of authorities. Many things are in provincial jurisdiction. So the commissioners often do joint investigations, and then they have a very powerful joint statement at the end of these investigations, which can be useful. The other thing is that sometimes writing to Parliament and having particular committees address an issue might be more fruitful, particularly if it crosses divides where it's going to be nebulous. You don't want to get stuck in years of data protection analysis as to whether a particular practice is permissible or not. You maybe want to go straight to the democratic level and talk to the MPs about it, because they can do the sniff test and say, hey, we don't want a society where this is permitted, and then you can have a special committee investigation. And third, of course, and I sometimes wonder how powerful the press is nowadays, but the press is great. And sometimes action at shareholder meetings can be great too. Nobody wants to be off the ethical companies list. And as I look at some of the things that are happening, particularly in this data analytics space, where they're measuring the ability of their staff to leave, if you've hired people, for instance, who are now all in the country and they're depending on your out of office work provisions, you've got a captive workforce, and I worry about that. Anyway, going to a shareholder meeting, producing materials for shareholder meetings, that could be useful. My gut tells me that we are going to get attention to these issues at a political and public press level and shareholder level faster than we are going to get law, because it's just so complicated. And I think, as Andrew was pointing out, these are international companies, actually, it was Eduardo. How do you harness them down? The other thing that I think everybody has to remember every single time we complain about these issues is transport-border data flow has not gone away as an issue. You lose your constitutional rights every time that data is in the cloud somewhere else, in the hands of a hostile regime. And these are things you have to check for. Particularly with pieces of software that you're purchasing from outside vendors. They're probably being processed in a good tax zone where you have no constitutional rights.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Curious, isn't it? Yes.
Wow. Well, a question for you. So last year was a record year for venture capital. $630 billion was piled into VC-backed companies by investors. But it's looking like the easy money era is over at the moment for cash burning tech companies in Silicon Valley. Over the past 6 weeks, especially, VC firms have been pulling back. They're no longer willing to invest in companies that don't seem to have a clear business model. There seems to be layoffs, combined with high inflation. Market liquidity is down. The decade of easy money seems to be over. And I'm wondering what you predict is going to happen over the next year. Do you see little tech being acquired by big tech? Do you see little tech starting to disappear, perhaps, because simply there's no way to sustain the investments in the technologies that they're developing? Any predictions?
Is that to me?
Yeah, well, I mean, I follow the venture capital money closely, and apparently seed funding is still pretty high. But yeah, I mean, I think one point to that goes into sort of what Stephanie and everyone's sort of talking about is like venture capital funding also became more global. So you saw a lot of money going into Latin America, so the proliferation is not only the US, it's become more, we have a lot more US investors investing in emerging tech companies in Latin America and Asia and other underrepresented. So there are tech booms happening in countries that are not in the global north, that I think in the absence of maybe, the same as the US, like not very strong labor protection or data protection, that is concerning. And I feel the urgency of what Stephanie was saying, like, and Andrew and everyone else. So yeah, I predicted that the innovation and the money will move to emerging countries where you could still untap for less money, maybe not give, millions of dollars. You could provide seed funding in sub-Saharan Africa entrepreneurs or in Paraguay entrepreneurs, give them smaller. So it'll become more global and maybe more cheaper and not, so West and Silicon Valley focused. So thinking globally in the next 5 or 10 years, I think it's really critical because the money will go from global north again to global south. And then I also see that the investors are, the money might not be there. I think there's a lot of mergers and acquisitions that are definitely beginning to happen. The entrance, I think a piece we didn't go into, the entrance of private equity into investing in tech companies is mainstreaming the investments in tech company from not just VCs. So there was, in our report, the Little Tech report, there was a entrance of private equity and hedge funds, which signals to capital markets that it's becoming more mainstream. And so venture capital will probably move into much more, deep tech, much more experimental, because like investing in tech companies is now you have private equity, now you have hedge funds. So the capital will come from other places. There'll be more capital market actors to engage in the conversation beyond just venture capital and to think about what does responsible innovation look like. Yeah, I can do that. And so much more the mainstreaming of investing in tech companies will become much more mainstream, not just held by venture capital. It'll become more global, and mergers and acquisitions will happen. And what reminded me of private equities, we tracked how private equities acquiring some of the tech companies themselves and holding them in our portfolio for who knows what. I mean, some of it we're monitoring what those trends lead to. And some of them are employment data broker related companies, which we didn't really go into. But so the mergers and acquisitions will happen, the globalization, the mainstreaming will complicate the set of actors investing in tech. And I think, little tech will continue, these smaller products will continue to exist. Thomas Reuter, Equifax, these like larger vendors, Microsoft 365, what Andrew mentioned, like they will continue to add solution after solution every year, these bigger mainstream players, and like, will the solutions continue to get much more intrusive? So like productivity score was 1 year. I think Ayden, me and you found a patent, I think that Microsoft filed a few years ago, or if it was like monitoring sentiment in meetings. So it was, the established vendors will continue to offer new solutions to employers, and that will be, the continuation of little tech through, SaaS providers that have been established. So that's sort of my prediction.
Thanks so much, Will. So we have 5 minutes left and no questions from the audience. So just to end us out, I'm going to ask everyone one final question. If you could try to keep your response to 1 or 2 minutes, that would be great. And that is, what is one recommendation you have on how workers who are impacted adversely by workplace surveillance tech can seek redress or take action? What should they be doing, or what should some other actor be doing? Eduardo, would you like to go first?
Sure. Well, just to keep it very short because of the amount of time, I think that, you know, the working together kind of approach is always one that I very much think is a good approach to take whenever, you know, initiatives from the private sectors, from employers come and affect workers' right. But the real situation at the same time is that unionization around the world is decreasing, like in terms of percentages. More and more the new generations perceive collective actions, perceive unions as problematic. And this is because, of course, there is a whole media discourse around this as well, and sustained by private sector companies that demonize unions in Latin America, at least. So it's definitely an issue, but I think that it is the way to go. And this is why there's so much investment into, you know, putting this or installing this discourse around, you know, the bureaucracy of unions, the inefficacy of unions. Just to give you a little fact, in Paraguay, we have 5% of unionization towards the country. We have one of the lowest in Latin America and most likely from the world. So this pretty much gives you an idea of why it's very difficult to think in these collective actions from unions, let alone when you're talking about tech companies operating in the country. So I would say that this is something that we should continue doing advocacy on, in terms of, like, you know, promoting the benefits and promoting the benefits of working together as workers and working cooperatively.
Thanks, Eduardo. Andrew?
I agree with that. I would still say if you are facing this or fear this or worry about this, join a union. If you haven't got a union, speak to your citizens' advice, is what we'd call it, or civic organizations. There are organizations out there. I think our job is to amass our collective willpower and bandwidth so that we are stronger together rather than atomize in countries and between countries. The forces are on the other side are large. And it's why we're trying not to make this just about individual rights, as I said. So we are trying to bring in tech agreements. We're trying to make data part of our collective bargaining. You know, we are in some ways lucky compared to Eduardo and some US colleagues here, in that we still have 1 in 4 workers are covered by a collective agreement in the UK. Collective agreements are pay, terms and condition. Data is a condition of work. Data is a term of work. Data can now determine whether you're paid or stay in employment. So we're seeking and training our shop stewards, our activists, our reps to bargain for data rights, to go beyond the law, to actually take those companies which are more enlightened and say, we want data frameworks. We want to collectively bargain and use GDPR and other laws we have within the space we're still in to go beyond. You know, these should not be a floor of rights. These should be something we build upwards. And we do great work with our Swedish colleagues, our German colleagues, our New Zealand colleagues, our US colleagues. We have to keep on sharing, because I think whatever happens to the capital funding, capitalism still exists. This data is about gamifying our work. We are going to be turned into, you know, factors into the means of production. This is a new form of technology, but it's not a new form of power in the workspace. We have seen it, we have named it, we know it. We just have to get better at how we fight it in its current form.
Thanks, Andrew. And Stephanie, your closing statement.
I would just like to look at the bright side of this rather dire situation. We're coming on hard times. There are plenty of people who are looking at a much darker future than their fathers and grandfathers had. Now is a good time to get people more concerned about the rising levels of poverty and the instability of people's employment and whether that actually works. long-term in a democracy. So it's an opportunity, and we should be able to capture public attention as people face rising costs and climate change and growing migration patterns. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephanie. We are now out of time, unfortunately, but thank you everyone for joining us today. And if you would like to read the report on Little Tech that Wilneida mentioned earlier, it's available at coworker.org. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.